Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Trying to get the chat box up and open. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kabaler Ganalan. I go by Cubby. I'm the Director for Neuroscience Research at DataJoint. And today I'll be talking to you about how to set up a local infrastructure for DataJoint development, and specifically targeted towards using the elements. And I'll kind of start by recapping a little bit of what's been talked about thus far this week. So Dimitri, David, and Tin have all talked about DataJoint elements, and kind of the nuances of how do you actually program in DataJoint and build these workflows. And Tin gave the example of building a workflow in array electrophysiology for NeuroPixels probes. And this is actually all done in our cloud environment that was developed by our team of engineers. And we offer that as a service, but all of our tools, as we mentioned, are open source. And so you can actually install all of these locally and do your development locally. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. Before I begin, I do want to just recap our resources. So we have datajoint.org, which outlines all of our open source tools. And then including DataJoint for Python, DataJoint for MATLAB, the documentations, the tutorials, Elements, Lab Book, Ferris, which are our other tools, and then how to get in contact with us through Stack Overflow, through Slack channels, and our GitHub repositories as well. And then we also have datajoint.com, which talks about us as a commercial company and how we help small, medium, and large-sized labs get up and running with DataJoint to build their computational workflows. And so today we'll be talking to you about setting up an infrastructure for DataJoint elements. And so that I'm going to start here on this GitHub repository. And I hope you don't mind, I'm just looking up at my screen. I have a bigger monitor looking up. That's why I'm looking away from my camera. But yes, I'll start on this GitHub repository. So it's github.com/datajoint elements. And this is our main landing page for all of our elements. And there are links to each specific element down below, such as array electrophysiology that Tin talked about yesterday. And so I'm going to click on this install.md file, which will go through the instructions on how to set up a local development environment. So for myself, I know it's hard for me to listen to a speaker as well as read along. So today I will just be reading along and pause and possibly expand on what's been documented here in text. So these are the setup instructions for workflows that are created with DataJoint elements. This following document is going to describe the steps to set up a development environment so that you can use DataJoint elements to build and run a workflow on your local machine. The DataJoint elements can be combined together to create a workflow that matches your experimental setup. And we have created some example workflows like workflow array ephys and workflow calcium imaging for your reference. And in this tutorial, we will install one of these example workflows. And yesterday, as you recall, Tin talked about workflow array ephys. So these instructions that I'll be talking about today can be adapted for your custom DataJoint workflow. And there are several ways to create a development environment. Here today, we'll discuss one method in detail, and I'll mention a few others along the way. And if you already have certain components set up, you can skip these sections. And just as a note, you will need administrative privileges on your system for the following setup instructions. And I also did want to note that today, I hope it's quite informal where we can, you can try to install it on your local machine, and please either just unmute yourself and feel free to chime in, or send a message in the chat box where you can let me know what issues you're having. I know everyone has a different operating system, different software versions. And so it's hard to gauge where the hangups are, but we'll be going through all the components of how to get the system up and running today. So the system architecture looks something like this. So the outer box represents some sort of integrated development environment, an IDE, where you'll be doing most of your work. Then within the IDE, you can open up your terminal or a Jupyter notebook. And then within that, you'll be using a Conda virtual environment with installed Python packages. And then within that, within a given Conda environment, you'll have a Python interpreter where you can run your commands and specifically use DataJoint to interact with the database. So today we'll be talking about each one of these 5 or 6 components. So let's start with an integrated development environment. Let's install that. The one I prefer to use is Microsoft's Visual Studio Code. And that's what I'm showing you a diagram up here. On the top box here is where you can browse all your code, open up a file and browse your code. On the left are basically a file browser. And then down here in the bottom right is a terminal window, terminal prompt. And then Microsoft Visual Studio Code, or VS Code as it's abbreviated, has a number of extensions. So you can add on these extensions to add on functionality to Visual Studio Code. And so as this says here, DataJoint development can be done with a plain text editor in the terminal. However, an integrated development environment, IDE, can improve your experiments. And in this setup example, we'll use Visual Studio Code. So as a first step, let's go ahead and open this link. And you can download whichever application, the application for whichever operating system you have. And so in my case, I would download, I'm working with a Mac operating system. And so I would download that file, and it's downloading right now. And then you saw it was a zip, so you'd unzip it and open up the application. Okay, thanks, Tim. So I'll zoom in on the window so that it's a little easier to read. Is that better? Perfect, perfect. Thanks, Pradeep. Yes, this window on the right is okay to keep open. We'll be using this for going forward. So I can open up. So when I'm using Visual Studio Code, so it downloaded, you unzip it. And then you would drag and drop this into your applications folder on your Mac. And that's here for me. And so I'm going to go ahead and I already have it installed. So I'll open up. And that's what this looks like here. And so just to give another working introduction to Visual Studio Code. So you have the file browser here on the left. You can actually open up a terminal window. The shortcut is Command J. So I have a terminal window here. And then if I open up a file, it'll show up on the top right. And we'll dig into this a little bit more shortly. So the next step is to install a relational database. And so a key feature of DataJoint is the ability to connect with a database server from a scientific programming environment, like Python and MATLAB. And this is so that your experimental data can be stored in the database and then downloaded from the database by anyone who has permissions for that database. And so there are several options if you would like to install a local relational database server. Here I've kind of listed 3 options to set, or 2 options to set up. So one is a Docker image for my SQL server, which is already configured for your use with DataJoint. And so and then the other option is installing a MariaDB server. So the option I'll talk about today is this Docker image. So I'll open this up. It's actually a GitHub repo. And just a word of caution. So setting up a database server is you have to be very cautious with it. So I would read through this documentation very carefully after this seminar, after this workshop. But I can briefly explain to you the steps to set it up. Excuse me. So this will require Docker. And so I already have Docker installed on my local machine. I can show you how to do that. Does everyone have Docker installed currently, or is that something that would be of interest to show how to do this? That might take some time, and it depends on your system, but we can at least try to talk about it. Okay, yeah, we can talk about it. Excuse me. So let me. Open up this window. Okay, so, and let me ask in the chat, so what operating systems are you all working with? Okay. So John says he has a Mac. I can go over that. Does anybody else have a different operating system? Windows? Okay, yeah, we can go over briefly both of those, and let me know if you have any issues. So if you go to, I'll put this in the chat, docs.docker.com/desktop. Docker Desktop is an application for Mac or Windows that allows you to create Docker containers and to run those. And so if you click on Mac and then install Docker Desktop for Mac, depending on which type of chip you have, so if it's an Intel chip or M1 or Apple Silicon chip, you can download the respective Docker desktops for Mac. So in this case, I have an Intel chip, so I would download this version. It's downloading now. Let's open up my file browser. And so it downloaded a DMG file, and I'll go ahead and double click on it. And while this is verifying, I will just show you how to do the Windows as well, but it's very similar. So you click on Windows, and you can say install Docker Desktop for Windows. And then there's a link again, and it'll download. It's downloading for me. I obviously can't use it, but it's a .exe, so you'd follow those instructions. And thank you all for your engagement. It's great to get feedback so I can know how to kind of address the questions or address your interests. Okay, so I get this window that pops up, and it basically says, drag and drop the application into my folder. And I actually already have it installed. And so I'm gonna not do that. I'm not gonna drag and drop it, but I have it installed in my applications folder. So if I go to my applications folder, I have Docker here, it'll open up. And this is what it would look like. We'll actually be interacting with it completely via the command line, but this is the Docker desktop application that you can also use. Yeah, Docker. Thanks, Tin. Yeah, so the question John had was, can you remind me briefly what is Docker? And so Tin responded, said, basically you can think of Docker as a way to set up a virtual machine, but it's super lightweight. And so, yeah, so it's basically Docker has these containers that are virtual machines. And so you can be running another operating system in on your local machine. And so in our use case, we'll be using, oh, sorry, I think I didn't actually drop this message to everyone. It was just went to Pradeep. So in our use case, we'll be using Docker for to run our MySQL server. Yeah, no problem, John. So John's, it's taken some time for him to download these. This is a large application. So one alternative, so using the Docker image setup for MySQL Server is one option, but we can for today's purposes, we can use DataJoint's tutorial database for our server. And John, you can come back to set up your MySQL server later on, and either later on in the workshop or after this, and you can send us a message on Slack, and we'd be happy to help in any way. And so I'll continue on. I know still setting up for some, but I'll continue on. So we're coming back to how do you set up MySQL for DataJoint using a Docker image. And so basically what you would do is you would, let me start by explaining that the Docker Compose file is a file here in this repository. And that actually is the one that will be used to set up your server, your database server. And so these are the commands that you would use. If you have Mac, we can slightly modify these commands. So let me go ahead and show you how this is done. So I'll open up my VS Code again, and I will navigate to my desktop. So I'm there, and I will create a directory, and then I'll change into the directory. And then I'll be downloading this Docker Compose YAML file, which will be setting up my database or the Docker image. And so I'm going to modify this command slightly. So I'll just do curl this output Docker compose.yaml. So basically what I'm doing is I'm downloading this file from GitHub, and I'm outputting it in my local directory as a Docker, and the file name is called Docker compose.yaml. So it downloaded, and I can take a look at it. So I'll just open up my file browser so we can just see it. So I have a folder here called MySQL Docker, and then my file here. And the contents are there as well. So I'll go back to my VS Code, and I can see that here as well. Okay, and so the command I would use to what's called bring up my container is called docker-compose up-d. So Docker Compose is the command. Up means bring up the container for this specific Docker Compose YAML file. And then -d means detached. So this terminal window won't be attached to that container, that environment. Okay, so now it's up and running. And so I can type in Docker PS, and I see that it started up 7 seconds ago. Yes, I see John said he has an error. It says my Z shell terminal does not have wget installed. Yes, and so this command actually won't, wget won't work. You'd have to install that separately. So what we can do is actually just use the curl function, the curl command. So if you type in curl and then that same file name -- output, and I can just copy and paste this into the chat box. That should download. Okay, perfect. That worked for John. And so coming back to our terminal window, we have typed in the word Docker PS. That basically shows me all of the Docker containers that are running right now. And so I have the one right now that all on one line. And that was created about 8 seconds ago with my Docker compose upd command. And so now I have a MySQL server that's set up. And there's a lot of nuances. As I mentioned, there's a lot of nuances to this MySQL server setup. So please read through this documentation on this GitHub repo under DataJoint MySQL Docker. It talks about persistence of the data and other things. So that I won't be discussing today. One thing I will touch on is that, so we created this MySQL Docker file, directory, and then within there, there's a data directory. And so your database configuration and data are stored in there. And so that's actually on your local machine. And your Docker container is attached to this directory. Okay, so now we are up and running with our database server. Let me just ask in the chat, were you able to download Docker and get it up and running? And if not, that's totally fine. We'll use a tutorial database for the remainder of this tutorial. Okay, so Docker compose upd did not work. The Docker compose directory or command could not be found. So that's likely a configuration with Docker. Think about the best way. Docker is downloaded and it installed. So Tin says that we might have to install Docker compose separately. Let's see. Let's try to debug this in real time if we can for a few minutes. So Docker desktop for Mac, including compose, along with other Docker apps. Maybe try Docker space compose upd. So let me type that in the chat, Docker compose upd. I know they've been changing things around a little bit with their commands.
That means that if you enable this, if any exception is an instance of this section class, it will
Yes, and then Tin says, try Docker PS to see if just Docker is running at all.
There are basically any instance of the DB will error with that. Including what? You go into a find a specific exception. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like Docker installed properly. And are you able to, John, are you able to open up the Docker desktop app?
Well, I think it's probably because not all people but it might make sense. Of course, if you look at free,
Yeah, so what I'm trying is more cheap rate.
checking.
Yeah, that's okay. Rate, which is our good in.
John, did this app set up pretty okay?
Yeah, because maybe if you just take up a little bit of issue that will
Okay, okay. It didn't unpack properly. Okay, yeah, you're redoing it now. Let me know how it goes. While you're setting that up, I'll continue on, but we can always come back to it to address, to catch back up. Okay, so now we have the MySQL for Docker image, Docker container up, and we will go back to our Markdown file, our installation Markdown file. So there are a couple different options to remind us where we are. So there's a couple different options of setting up a local relational database server. We went through the Docker image for MySQL Server, and there's also MariaDB. Both of those options work. Alternatively, if you want to, for the simplicity of this tutorial, you can use the DataJoint Playground tutorial database, which is located at tutorial-db/datajoint.io, which has already been configured for you. I wouldn't use this kind of beyond this tutorial purposes for your actual experimental results because this storage is not persistent. Okay, so now we have our database, or we have at least access to our tutorial database here. So we can move on to the next step. So the next step is we want to install a version control system. So Git is an open source distributed version control system for collaborating with software development. And GitHub is a platform that hosts projects managed with Git. And the example DataJoint workflows are actually hosted on GitHub. So we will use Git to download the repository. And we suggest for your own DataJoint workflow development, we recommend that you use Git and GitHub so you can collaborate and work easier on your code development. And many systems actually come pre-installed with Git. You can actually test if Git is installed by typing Git in the terminal window. So I'll go ahead and open my VS Code again. And I have the terminal window here. I'll go ahead and clear it. Type in clear. And then type in Git. So Git was recognized. It's a little doc string on how to actually use Git. So I do have Git installed, and Macs do have Git installed. And so you can just test if you have Git installed. If Git is not installed on your system, we can go through, we can at least talk about briefly how to install it on your system. Can you let me know in the chat if Git is installed? If not, we can dive a little bit deeper into that installation process. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Looks like 2 people have Git installed. That's great. Okay, so I won't go into this in much detail, but I'll just open up this link, just show you that this is the installation instructions for installing Git, either on Linux or on Mac OS or on Windows. So for those who don't have Git installed, you can use these instructions. Go ahead and close a couple windows. Okay, so that's Git and GitHub. And before I move on to the next section, I'll just say, so we mentioned that the example DataJoint workflows are hosted on GitHub. I'll just navigate to those briefly just to show you where they are. So I go to github.com, and this is my dashboard, and then I search for workflow array EFIS. So it's under the DataJoint organization. Oops. DataJoint organization, and then workflow array EFIS. And this is all the source code for these workflows and documentation, as well as the source code for the Python packages that the workflows use. So for instance, element array EFIS is here. Okay, so coming back to where we were. So the next step is to install a virtual environment. So we talked about Docker. An alternative virtual environment system is called Conda. So we'll talk about using that. And in some cases, in some use cases, Conda is a little bit easier to use than Docker. And so we'll be using that for our use case. So a virtual environment allows you to install packages that you require for a specific project within an isolated environment on your computer. So you can imagine you can have 2 projects on your computer and different package requirements. And so if you install them in 2 separate virtual environments, there won't be any conflicts between those 2 different projects. And so it's highly recommended, though not strictly required, to create a virtual environment to run the workflow. And Conda, Virtual ENV, and Docker are virtual environment managers, and you can use either option. Below, we'll talk about the commands for Conda. So we will install mini Conda, which is a minimal installer for Conda. And so I'll ask in the chat, does anyone have experience or have Conda installed on their local machine? Okay, we have one person who does. No, okay, yeah, we can go through it briefly. So, you'll select the mini Conda installer link for your operating system and follow the instructions here. So I'll open up this link. I don't want to butcher your name, but I think it's Vitaly. I think you had a Windows machine. Is that correct? So you can select whichever link is relevant for you. So probably 64-bit, and it will download a file. I'll just download it for illustrative purposes. So it's again a .exe, and so you would follow those instructions. Perfect. You are taking care of it. I'll give you a few minutes just so you can get that up and running. And in the meantime, I'll ask John, did you get Docker working? Okay, so John says Docker does work. I'm still with the Docker. What would be the Mac OS equivalent of sudo apt-get install MySQL client? Just to take a step back, I'm just trying to understand why do you need to run that command, John? Oh, these commands here. By default, the database sets up a root user with this password simple. You can access your local running MySQL server using MySQL client on Ubuntu. Yes, that was the next step in the README. So let's hold off, actually. We'll connect to it through DataJoint. And so if you were able to run Docker Compose upd and that worked okay, we'll come back to that and actually connect to the database through DataJoint. Okay, perfect. John says Docker Compose worked. So yeah, we'll come back to actually connecting to the database a little bit later on. Excuse me one second. Okay, and so let me ask, Vitali, were you able to get Miniconda installed? Okay, it's finishing up right now, so we can hold off for a couple more minutes. And so as you're finishing up, one way to tell that it's installed properly is if you go to your terminal window and you type in Conda, and again, the doc string will show up for Conda. And so then you'll know you actually have it installed and the path, it knows where to find it. If not, let me know and we can go into that. Okay, finished installing. Do you actually have access to it on your terminal window? Okay, perfect. Yeah, it seems to be working. Great, that sounds great. If not, you would have to modify your path environment variable so that the terminal window knows where your Miniconda directory is located, and the instructions are shown here. So if it doesn't work, let me know and we can work on modifying the path environment variable. Okay, so for this tutorial, we'll create a new Conda environment. So the following command is how you would create a new Conda environment. You obviously have to insert, the command says Conda create, so creating, and then the name -n of the environment. So you can name it whatever you would like, and then the Python version that you want to use. So I've shown you an example command to use here. So Conda create -n. In this case, we're going to be doing workflow array efs, and then the Python version I want to use. So I can go ahead and hit the copy button here. I'll come to my terminal window, hit clear. And then type the command in here. And I'm actually going to modify it because I actually already have a workflow array efs on my machine. So I'll just type in conda create and workflow array efs -incf and then Python version. And it's going to go ahead and create, and I'm going to say proceed with yes. And it created. And so the way to actually enter this Conda environment is to type in this command here. So Conda activate, and then the the environment name that I named it. So I'll copy that, hit enter, and you notice here on the left, it switched from base to workflow array EFIS INCF. So that tells me I'm in this specific Conda environment. And David, my colleague David, he gave a cheat sheet to some common Conda commands. And this is quite helpful. Let me go ahead and open this up to show you. So this is a cheat sheet that David posted in the chat. Thank you, David. And it shows things like creating a new Conda environment. So Conda create, name, whatever name you want, and then the Python version and other things as well. So please do keep this for future reference. Okay, so we can come back to here. And so we've done the last step of Conda activate and then our environment name. And so John asks, is the idea that one makes a separate Conda environment for each workflow? Yes, that would be the idea, is that for each kind of project, each kind of workflow that you're building, you would build a separate, you would create a separate Conda environment so that all the packages for that workflow are contained within that one Conda environment. Perfect. And so I'll go ahead and clear my screen. And so congratulations, we now have our Conda environment installed and activated on our machines. And so we can continue on to the next step. So the next step is to install the packages that Jupyter Notebook requires. So as we'll show you in the next few steps, or later on in the workshop, we use Jupyter Notebooks quite often to help work through the workflows. And so we'll be installing relevant packages for the Jupyter Notebooks. So we'll be doing Conda installs the command to install packages, and then we'll be installing Jupyter, IPyKernel, and NB Conda kernels. Those are the 3 packages we'll be installing. So I'll copy this, come to my terminal window, and again, I'm in this Conda environment, workflow array EFIS INCF. Paste this in there and hit enter. And it's going to ask me, do I want to proceed? I'm going to say yes. Okay, now it's done. It installed those 3 packages. And another set of 3 packages to install so that the tool dj.diagram can render the images properly is Conda install GraphViz, Python GraphViz, and PyDot+. I'll copy that and paste it in. And I'll just clear my window first to clean. So let's see if okay, it's going to ask me if I want to proceed. I'll say yes. Okay, and I'm installed. So those packages are now installed. Is everyone caught up to this point? And I guess just to recap, so we've installed our integrated development environment. So in our case, VS Code. We've installed Docker, and we've installed, brought up our Docker container for the MySQL server. And we've installed our version control system, Git. We've installed our virtual environment, Conda. We've created a Conda environment, and then we've installed our Jupyter Notebooks. Okay, and before I move on, I'll just wait. Seems like Vitaly's close to getting the Jupyter notebooks installed, so I'll just wait for a few minutes. Okay, perfect. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so we're going to clone and install our DataJoint workflows. So I have examples for how to do that for workflow array EFIS and workflow calcium imaging. So I'll click to expand for details, and we'll just go through the workflow array EFIS today, but you're welcome to go back through the workflow calcium imaging and install that as well later on. So I'll read through these instructions. So in your terminal window, change directories to where you want to clone the repository. So CD projects. Let's see where I am right now. Present working directory. I'm in desktop MySQL Docker. So I'm going to actually move up one directory. And let's see what's in here. So I have a bunch of installer files. So I'll go ahead and create a projects directory in here. So make dir projects. And I'll see that. I see the projects directory here, and I'm going to change directories into the projects directory. Okay. So then the next step is to actually download our workflow array EFIS. And so I just want to go back to the GitHub repository to show you what I'm downloading. So I'm in the DataJoint organization, workflow array EFIS GitHub repository. And this is all the source code for workflow array EFIS. And so the next step is we're going to be downloading this to our local machine so that we can actually run it locally. And I'll just recap one of the reasons why we want to download it is it has these set of Jupyter notebooks. I'll click into this folder that shows you how to run through the workflow array EFIS so that you can get your NeuroPixels data into the database and interact with it. So we'll be downloading this entire database, or sorry, this entire repository. So I'll go back to my instructions. So that's the command, git clone, and then that's the repository we're at, github.com/datajoint workflow array EFIS. So I'll copy that into my projects directory where I'm located. So now it's cloning and it's done. So let's see, I'm in the projects directory and it created a directory called workflow array EFIS. So I'll change into it and I'll list all items. And so all the items that we just saw on github.com are now on our local machine. And I changed directories into that repository. And so the next step is to actually install this workflow in your Conda environment. And so that would be pip install -e dot. So I'll go ahead and copy this. And so actually, before I paste it in, I'll clear my screen and I'm going to type in Conda list. This is going to list all of the Python packages that are installed in this Conda environment, workflow array EFIS -INCF. And so it lists everything down here. And so you'll see, I know that DataJoint's not installed yet. I know the elements are not installed yet, and the workflow's not installed yet. So I'll go ahead and clear the screen. I'll copy this pip install -e dot. So what this is going to do, it's going to install in editable mode, and I'll talk about that in a minute, everything in this repository. That's what the dot means. So it's installing all of the Python packages that are necessary to be running this DataJoint workflow. It'll take a few minutes. Okay. Excuse me. So I think we're done. So I'll go ahead and clear my screen. clarity. It says here, before I clear, I'll say this is successfully installed, and it lists out all the packages that it installed. So I'll go ahead and clear the screen. I'll do Conda list again. And so what I'll show you is that it installed DataJoint. It installed the DataJoint elements that this workflow requires. Whoops, sorry. Let's go back. It installed the DataJoint elements that this workflow requires. And it installed workflow array EFIS, so this repository that we cloned to our local machine. Okay, and then I'll explain what this -e flag is. So basically, it's a flag that allows you to install this repository in editable mode. So if you need to edit any of the code that's in this repository that you cloned, for instance, in a couple of the scripts like pipeline.py or pass.py, you can edit it, and then you can still use that version. Let me rephrase. If you edit those files, when you run your DataJoint workflow, it'll use the most updated version of your workflow array EFIS code that you've edited if you use the -e flag. So it allows for a little more customization. So let me pause here and ask, is everyone set up with installing workflow array EFIS in their Conda environment? Okay, we're still installing, so I'll hold off. Okay, just finished. Perfect. Congratulations. The workflow array EFIS is now installed, so let's move on to the next step. So we're getting close. So the next step is to connect to the database server. And so one way to set up a connection to the database server with DataJoint is to create a local configuration file. DJ local config localconf.json at the root of the repository with the following template. So for workflow array EFIS, this is what it would look like. And so this specifies the host name, the username, and the password, and where your data will be stored, as well as a prefix for any of your database schemas. So I'll go into each one of these items individually. Before I do, I should mention that we can go ahead and open up our directory where our workflow array EFIS data or repository is stored. So let's go ahead and click open folder. And I'll go to desktop, projects, and workflow array EFIS. And I'll go ahead and click open. It's going to refresh the page. And then the shortcut, then you can go to, let's see here. If you go to File and View, you can show your panel, which shows the terminal window, or the shortcut on Mac is Command-J. So I have the terminal window there, and I have my workflow array EFIS directory here with all the files that are there. And so what I can do is I want to create this DJ localconf.json file. So go ahead, and in this directory, I'll click this new file button, and it'll create a new file, and I'll say DJ localconf.json. And so then I'll copy this into here. And for my host, because I have my local Docker container with a MySQL server, I could type in localhost. The username, as that GitHub repo said, is root, and the password is simple. And the prefix will be, if it's a tutorial database, it'll be your usernames. So maybe, so if it was using a tutorial database, it would be something like this, EFIS Since I'm on my local machine, I can do whatever I want, but I'll just keep it like this so it's consistent. And then this, you'd specify where your data is stored. And we can talk about that later on, but let's just go ahead and keep it like this. Although I have no data stored there right now. And just to recap, so the purpose of this DJ local config is so that when you start DataJoint, it's going to read this file. And what it's going to do is connect to this host with these credentials automatically. So whenever you import DataJoint and run the connection command, it'll automatically connect. And so that's the benefit of having this in this one file. It's set up kind of for continual use, repeated use. And so I'll come back to the instructions on the left. So you specify the host name, the username, and the password, which I talked about. And so if we're using, as I mentioned, the Docker image, the host name will be localhost, and then the username and password will be root and simple. If you're using the tutorial database, the host name will be tutorial-db.datajoint.io, and the username and password will be your credentials for your DataJoint account. And then, as I mentioned, you specify the database prefix, which will be the prefix for your schema names. And then where your data is actually stored. So the EFIS root data dir. So congratulations, at this point, you have your development environment set up. Does anyone have any questions? And is everyone kind of at the same point that I'm at? Yes, there's a question in the chat. Doesn't matter what I name, excuse me, what I name the JSON file. It actually does, because DataJoint is going to look for that JSON file in that root directory of the repository. So you'll have to use DJ_local_conf.json. Vitaly says, has to catch up later, but needs to run. Yeah, no problem. Thank you for joining, and thank you for being engaged. Appreciate it. Any other questions? Okay, I'll continue on. So for those individuals who have NeuroPixels data or 2-photon calcium imaging data, you can use your data in the data format that I'll describe later on in the directory structure that I describe later on to work with this array EFIS or the 2-photon calcium imaging workflows. If not, we do have example data sets, and those are available here in these instructions. There's a question in the chat. Let me see. Can you type the name? Sorry, I don't see the name on the tutorial. Yes. So I think referring to the name of the configuration file. So I'll go ahead and type that here. Perfect. John, I'll give you a second to catch up. Just let me know when you're ready. Okay, perfect. So congratulations, you're all set up with your development environment. And let me just actually, before I move on to the data, let me just go up to the top and recap. So we have set up our integrated development environment with VS Code. We have our terminal window, and eventually I'll show you the Jupyter notebook as well. We've installed our virtual environment Conda, and we've installed the Python packages for workflow array EFIS. We have our Python interpreter where we can type our commands in, and I'll show you that briefly. And the next part I'll show you is using DataJoint to connect to the database server that we set up. So scroll back down to where we're at. So as I was mentioning, so if you have NeuroPixels data or 2-photon calcium imaging data for the workflows that we described here, you can use that to work with the workflows. Alternatively, we do have some example data sets that you can download from our storage site that we call DataJoint Archive with example data sets. And the instructions for that are here. That's kind of beyond the scope of today's tutorial, but please do refer back here. And if there are any questions, please do send us a message on Slack. And if you are using your own data sets, there's a specific directory structure and file naming convention that we have for the workflows. And they're described here. So for workflow array EFIS, it's described here, where the EFIS root data dir is configured in the JSON file that we created. And there's some other nuances to the actual directory structure. I can just come to this code snippet here. So you have the root data directory, then you have each subject directory, then you have a session directory, and then you have your data sets for that session, and so on. And in this data set directory, you have your acquired data, metadata, and then your kilosort data as well. And something similar for calcium imaging. So again, you would define what the imaging root data directory is going to be in your DJ local config. So that's the absolute path. And then for the relative path, so relative to imaging root data directory, you would have your subject directory, session directory with your raw TIFF files. And then if you're using Suite2P, you would have the output Suite2P here, or your Kaiman results as well. And so I'll briefly touch on that, but we won't be going through much of the data ingestion that we talked about, that Tim talked about yesterday. And so we won't be going to these kind of details today, but I want to be able to show you how to actually run the workflow, create the tables on your MySQL server, and then you can, after this workshop, you can run through with an example data set, like Tim did yesterday in our cloud environment. So the next step is interacting with the DataJoint workflow. So let's now connect to our database and import the tables. So for workflow array EFIS, we can type this command here. So a couple steps I need to add. So we come back to our terminal window. We do Conda activate workflow array EFIS INCF. So we're in our Conda environment. And then we want to type IPython. That'll be our Python interpreter. And then we'll type in import. Let's see what directory we're in right now. Make sure we're in the correct directory. So I'm in projects, workflow array EFIS. And then I'll type in import DataJoint as DJ. Enter. Okay, it's connected, or it's imported. So now I want to actually connect to it. If I just type in this command here, because we set up this DJ local config, it should connect to the database. And yep, it did connect. So DataJoint connection.
We can only really skip the stop points. If we were to not.
And now let's go ahead and run this command here. So this command behind the scenes, what it does is it instantiates the tables from workflow array efs onto your MySQL server that you just set up locally, as well as a few other items. So okay, so there's an error in the chat. Let's see. So it says import DataJoint as DJ does not work. It cannot find the module. So let's see. Are you in the Conda environment that we had set up? In my case, I'd called it workflow array efs. Okay, so you are in the Conda environment. Can you type into the terminal window Conda list and see if DataJoint is installed there? This gives the error, so let's see. There's an error. Let's see what the error looks like. So value error, the Python kernel does not appear to be a Conda environment. Please use pip install instead. So is this related to the VS Code terminal now using for the first time? Possibly. Which shell are you using in your VS Code? Yeah, so maybe try on this plus sign here if you're using VS Code. See if there's any other options here. I think you were using Z shell before. So if you could try to click on that, it'll open up a new one. It says Z shell is the default. Okay. So what it seems like is that terminal window can't find Conda where your Conda environment's installed. Trying to figure out how to debug this. So one thing we could do, John, if you were using a different terminal window before outside of VS Code, we could just kind of see if we could continue there and we can come back to getting VS Code working later. Okay, so it worked in the other terminal window. Let's see. So I guess there's two options because I'm not sure how to debug this. One is says, so David says, it's possible that when you opened a new terminal window, the new environment wasn't activated. This is common. It happens to me in VS Code. Yeah, it seems not to be able to access Conda in the terminal window. The other option, John, is I could stop my share, and if you're open to it. Okay, so this is the prompt in your VS Code. Yeah, so it does seem that the virtual environment is working. What happens when you type Conda there? Is that the value error that popped up? So Conda runs fine. Okay, you're right, because that's Conda's activated there. Okay, so that makes sense.
Somewhere along the line, somebody said it was
Python.
how do we know?
Well, it doesn't seem that. So David said, should he try DJ Con to see if everything is connected? Well, it doesn't seem like DataJoint can be actually imported, and I think that's the issue. Tin says, what happens if you type in IPython? Okay, so IPython works. So within the IPython prompt, why don't you try to type in import DataJoint? That gives the error module not found. Yeah. Okay, and just to clarify, John, see, if we go back to the instructions, were you able to run this command here, pip install -e dot? Okay, so how about within your VS Code, in the terminal prompt outside of IPython, you type in Conda list and see if DataJoint is installed there. The other alternative is I can stop my share, and if you want to share your screen, we can help walk through this. Okay, so it says version 13.2 is installed. But when you type in IPython, it doesn't actually import DataJoint. Okay, so to summarize, basically, everything works fine in your normal terminal window on the Mac. But when you go to the terminal window on your VS Code, you can activate your Conda environment, workflow array efs, and type in IPython. And when you type in IPython and do import DataJoint, it doesn't work. But DataJoint is actually installed in that Conda environment. Okay, yeah, John, if you can share your screen, I can stop sharing mine, and that might be easier to walk through this bug. Okay, it looks, yeah. Yeah, DataJoint's installed there. Okay. If you scroll down to a terminal prompt, okay, so you're, let me just open up the chat so I have that. Yeah, and I see on your left, you're able to import DataJoint. It's working fine. Should be the same terminal. Can you type in, so can you type IPython in your VS Code terminal and import element underscore animal and type enter? Can you scroll up to see if that's installed? Let's see if that's also installed. Might be element dash animal. I might have misspelled it. Yes, sorry. Do element dash animal. Yeah, that's not the right syntax. Okay. That's not picking that up as well. So Tin says maybe try to, you may have already tried this, but try to deactivate. So exit out of IPython in your VS Code and try to deactivate that Conda environment and reactivate it. So type in Conda deactivate and then enter and then do Conda activate. Yeah. And then again, type in IPython and let's see, import DataJoint. Yeah, maybe try Conda deactivate. Type in IPython here to see if anything that works. Oh, I think there's a misspelling there. IP, yeah. Try importing DataJoint here. Yeah, both Tin and I have never seen this before. Maybe try opening up a new terminal window in VS Code. So on the if you, there's a plus button and then, yep, perfect. So now try to Conda activate. Workflow array eFIS. I think it's workflow array eFIS, and it might be dashes instead of an underscore. And then type in IPython and import DataJoint there. Okay. I guess with everything with computers, restart kind of works. So this might be something with VS Code, but glad this is working now. Awesome. Thanks for bearing with us. It's definitely an odd thing. But yeah, I guess when in doubt, maybe deactivate the Conda environment, reactivate it, and then open up a new terminal window.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure. Okay, awesome. Okay, perfect. So the next step, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so let's catch. Okay, so we are here. If you can type in, just make sure you're in your current directory of workflow array EFIS. And type in dj.con. And it should say DataJoint connection connected. Let me open up my chat box again, just to make sure I have it. Okay. And then type in this command here, and it's copied from the instructions. So right here, copy that. And paste that in here and run that. And once that runs, we should be able to view our, so what this command is going to do is going to declare your tables on your database server that you've connected to. And in this case, it's our local database server. And so we can now view our tables. There'll be no data there yet, but we can at least view them. So one table we can view is subject.subject and success. We have a table declared here where the subject, the gender, the date of birth, and the description are there. You'll notice a little asterisk here. That means it's the primary key to uniquely identify that entry. We can look at other things. So EFIS recording, that will be here as well. So these tables are now declared on our database. And so as the next step, so for an in-depth explanation of how to run the workflows and explore the data, we actually have a series of Jupyter notebooks, and then Tin went through a couple of them yesterday. We have them for workflow array EFIS and workflow calcium imaging. These links are the links to the GitHub repos, but we also downloaded our entire workflow array EFIS GitHub repo. So we have the notebooks actually right here. So if you click on notebooks, and we've already set up our configuration, so we don't need to do that now, but the notebook that Tin went through yesterday is the process notebook. So we can open that up. And this is the exact same notebook that Tin went through yesterday in terms of entering in the subject metadata and so on and so forth. So you can run through this with your own data set or with the example data set that we provided here above to download. The download does take a little bit of time, and that's why we're not going to go through that today, but you can do that later on. And one nuance is that for the Jupyter notebooks with Conda, you'll have to choose your Python interpreter here. So you have to, on the top right, you'll have to select a kernel. You'll have to scroll down to the Python interpreter you want to use to run this Jupyter notebook. So in this case, I have the Conda environment workflow array EFIS INCF, and the Python interpreter is there. So I'd select that, and now it's selected as Python 3.8.11. That's what I installed with that Conda environment. And then the workflow array EFIS INCF. And so it would actually run through this notebook. And so, John, were you able to get to this point where you can actually view the empty tables in your database? Perfect, great. And I'll just, so congratulations, you have a fully functional development environment on your local machine to support your neuropixels experiments and or your two-photon calcium imaging experiments. And I'll scroll down just to kind of wrap up. So one other option we have is DataJoint Labbook, which is a web application. It's a graphical user interface, and this is a nice GIF of this application. And it helps working with the DataJoint tables. So on the right here, I showed you how to actually use the command line to view these tables. But with DataJoint Labbook, you can actually use an interface, graphical interface, to interact with the tables. So here it's showing you all the schemas that you have in your database, the tables, and then within a given table, you can actually view all of the entries here. And so there's documentation, which includes the prerequisites, installation, and running the application. Since we have a little bit of time, I think I might actually kind of impromptu just go through this. If you're interested, John, if not, we can kind of skip this. Okay, perfect. Yeah, let's go through this. Okay, so I'll go ahead and open up this documentation here. So this is the outline for the documentation. I'll just click on I'll navigate to the GitHub repo as well. So let me go back here. So this is the GitHub repository. It's all open source. So the source code is all here. And it links again to the documentation that I just opened. So the prerequisites include Docker and Docker Compose, and we went through that today, which is great. So the next thing would be to download the Docker Compose deploy YAML file to be able to bring up that Docker container. So that's located here, and clicking this button will download that YAML file to my computer. And so I can open up my Finder window. And so that file is located right here. And so the command to bring up this application is shown right here. So this is the command, and you'll notice that it has a Docker Compose in there, and then it specifies the file name. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. I'll come back to my VS Code, and I'll open up a new terminal window. Maybe I'll just close this one since we're kind of at a done point here. And I'll check my present working directory. So I need to go up to the desktop because that's where the Docker Compose file is located. So change directories 2 directories up. So now on the desktop, we'll do ls. I can see my Docker Compose deploy YAML files here. So I've copied this command, and I'll now paste it in the terminal. So now it's bringing up that Docker container for this web application. Still running, takes a few seconds. Okay, perfect. And so now, if I type in Docker PS, let's go ahead and expand this window. So I have 2 containers that are running, 2 Docker containers that are running on my local machine, or I guess 3 actually. So the one that we started about an hour ago for our SQL server, and then the 2 related to the DataJoint Labbook. So now it's actually running. So now I can actually go to my window, and because we're running it locally, the URL is actually fakeservices.datajoint.io, and that's the web application, the login window to the web application. And I'll type in so the same host name and username and password, host address, username and password will be the case for logging in here. So it's root and then simple. Oh, maybe it's host.docker.internal. Okay, so let me log back out and explain that in a second. So again, you're going to navigate to this URL, and I'll type that in the chat. Yes, there's a question in the chat. So where does the Docker Compose deploy go? So you can download that YAML file to any location on your local file system. And as long as you're in the same directory as that local file system, in your terminal window, you'll be fine. So let's say you download it to your desktop. You want to be, let's say you download this Docker Compose deploy YAML file to your desktop. You'll want to run the Docker Compose command from the same directory that your Docker Compose deploy YAML file is located. Does that make sense? So it actually doesn't have to be in the workflow or Reif's repository or anything like that. Okay, so let me come back to the documentation. So you'll copy this command here and paste it into your terminal window and hit enter. And let me know when you're up and running and we can go from there. Okay. Okay, it's downloading now. Yes, the Docker containers do take some time to download. Docker images do take some time to download since this is the first time. So we'll hold off for a few minutes before we move on. And John, while it's downloading, may I ask you what modality of are you planning on using these workflows for? Is this neuropixels or two-photon calcium imaging? And for the different experiments, which acquisition systems and which analysis packages are you interested in or are you using? Okay. So you use NeuroPixels and NeuroNexus. Intan, and then also GLX and NeuroPixels. Okay, so you're trying to set this up for your entire lab. That's great. That's great. Yeah, it's definitely it takes some time, as you've seen today. But if you do need any help setting this up, please do reach out. You can contact us on Slack, or you can just email me directly. We've developed these DataJoint elements as an open source tool for the neuroscience community, so we want as many users as possible, and we're in a great position to be funded by the NIH to help users use these tools. So we'd be happy to help you use this. And John, just back to your point about NeuroNexus and INTEN. So as Tim mentioned yesterday, our workflows and elements are adaptable to work with really any acquisition system, any analysis package. Just the loaders have to be developed. And so we can show you how to develop these loaders for these different data sets from these different acquisition systems. And so you could possibly use INTEN and NeuroNexus with this as well. You just have to develop a loader. Oh, okay, there might be another lab who's kind of done this as well. Yeah. Yeah, and we'd be happy to help you try to get the NeuroNexus and INTEN systems integrated into this as well. Okay, perfect. So the download's done. Did the Docker compose? So if you type in Docker PS, does it show that you have those two other containers that are up and running? Okay, perfect. So it seems that the Docker containers are up and running. So now if you go to your web browser and you navigate to, let me type this in the chat, fakeservices.datajoint.io. It's just our internal term for kind of locally hosted, locally run DataJoint Labbook web app. This should prompt, and because you're using your local host, you'd actually type in, for your host name, it would be host.docker.internal. The username would be root, and the password would be simple. And I'm logged in now. So Tin asks, can you set the host name to localhost? So I tried that, Tin, and it threw out an error. So I tried localhost, root, password, and there's an error I haven't been able to pin down yet. The browser says the site does not exist. Firefox browser. Could be. I'm not as familiar with Firefox, but do you have another browser you could try? Maybe Chrome or Safari. Here's a Chrome window. Let's try it in Chrome. Yeah, this might be also related to a certification issue. I know that this is safe for me, so I'm going to proceed. So I log in there. Tin asks if I could try a different host name. So let's try 127.0.0.1. And it still throws the same error, Tin. So we can try to work with our team and figure out why this would be the case later on. Yeah, no, thanks, Tin. I was trying to figure this out too, and I couldn't. So I settled on using host.docker.internal. So it says it can't find the DNS. Maybe try going to localhost. Maybe try navigating to localhost in your URL. That might work as well. Yeah, so you'd actually just type in your browser, you would type in, so let's type in here, local host and type in enter. Not here. Let's HTTPS localhost should work. Yes, so you type in HTTPS//localhost. I'll copy and paste that in here. And there's a security, you just want to make sure that's secure. I know that it is, so I can proceed. Okay, perfect. So that works now. And then for the host name is host.docker.internal, root, and simple. And thanks for bearing with us, John. This was not as smooth as I wanted it to be in terms of navigating to it. We'll kind of work internally with our engineering team to make this a smoother experience. Okay, so it works. So you're able to log in. And so you can see on the left column are your database schemas. So coupler_efis, let's say _efis. So the coupler_efis_ is the prefix, and that you can see that for all the schemas. And then let's say the subject schema. And I can click on the subject table, and it shows the number of entries. Right now it's 0, but we will enter in some entries in the future. And there are different options here. So it shows the attributes, the columns of this table. So subject here, sex, subject birthday, and subject description. And subject is highlighted in green because it's the primary key. And the table information for the DataJoint tables are here. So you can see the subject, so the data type, and then that's the primary key is designated by this dash line. So anything above that is the primary key. Anything below that is a secondary key. And so you have sex, birthday, and description. And you can also filter in. So you can, if you have thousands of entries, you can filter to choose which subject you want to look at or which genders you want to look at. You can say you want to be equal to, and then all the males, females, and it would select those in this table. And then you can actually manually insert data. So let's say you have a new subject. So a new subject, let's say, call it subject 1, say it's male, and then let's say birth date was, let's say 2 years ago. So September 2nd, 2019. And we'll just say this is test data. And I can insert that into the table, and shortly it should show up. Let's go try that one time. Why didn't that refresh? Okay, just have to refresh. So now that data is inserted here. Subject 1, gender, birthday. So you can insert data. You can update fields. So I can select the field I want to update. Let's say I actually misidentified the gender, or let's say I want to update the subject description. No longer test data. I can update that, and it now updates here to say no longer test data. And let's say I actually inserted this data by mistake, so I can actually delete this entry, delete, and I can confirm delete, and it's gone. Thanks, John, for the note. So this, he says, this interface will make a huge difference in terms of getting others to use DataJoint. Very nice. Thanks. Yeah, we're definitely excited about this, and we have a roadmap to add more features to this in the future in terms of visualizations. And so we'll be kind of adding that over the next year or so. And so, yeah, that's basically the interface for viewing your tables, your DataJoint tables, and manipulating the data. And you can insert metadata and view any other entries here. And so, yeah, that's DataJoint Labbook in a quick nutshell. If you have any other questions, John, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, we can kind of summarize and wrap up. Yes, and Tim makes a good point. So you can certainly connect to other database servers as well, given that you have credentials. So from here, you can actually connect to the tutorial database. Yes, so thanks, Tim, for that. So you can actually connect to other databases as well. So let me show you how to do that. So let's say we want to connect to the tutorial database here, tutorial-db.datajoint.io. My username is this. Let me grab my password. So this is a database that's hosted on Amazon Web Services, and I can connect to it using this as well. And so now all of my schemas are here. And so I can see my tables as well here. There's no data in this table, but I can log into that database and use it as well here. So thanks, Tim, that was a good point. And so, yeah, let me come back to this instructions. So thank you for sticking in there and setting up your development environment. Seems like most of the components are set up for you. So John, do please reach out if you have any questions. But to summarize, we set up a development environment with VS Code. We can use the terminal or Jupyter notebooks to run Python and import DataJoint and run our workflows. We have a Conda virtual environment set up with our installed Python packages, including DataJoint, the workflows and the elements. Then we have our Python interpreter. And that's all connecting with DataJoint to our database server that we set up with Docker and with the Docker container that is running on MySQL server. And we are able to actually access this database also through DataJoint Labbook as well, using that web application, which is a nice graphical interface. Okay, so there was an error that says, when trying to log into the tutorial DB, can't connect to MySQL server on tutorial. Yeah, so it might actually be that the host name is slightly off. So let's try to see if I can fix that. So tutorial DB dot. So try this host name and see if that works. Okay, perfect. It was just a typo. Awesome. Glad you're able to visualize the tutorial database through DataJoint Labbook as well. Well, that being said, it was great to work with you to set up your local DataJoint development environment. Please do reach out. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to stick around. But other than that, we'll wrap up a little early today. Yeah, and thank you, David and Tin, for your help today. It was definitely needed both of your guidance, so that's helpful. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks, John. Glad you're able to get up and running, and yeah, we look forward to hearing back.
Great, thanks everyone. I will stop the stream now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Take care.